Oh, hey, what's up? Dusk here. Why don't you grab yourself a seat, something to drink? Well, let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about the state of Dead by Daylight and how it's going to eventually die, as all games eventually die, or at least dwindle down to a niche-sized player base that, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much dead. Now, if you're hoping this is a video where I'm going to bash on Dead by Daylight and I'm like, it's dead in a year, it's dead already, that's not this kind of video. Dead by Daylight has a lot of legs left on it. The game is going to be around for a while. So what really is the point of the video? Well, I want to walk through and explain how games typically do sort of go in decline so that you can understand where things are going, why they stick around, why your new upcoming favorite game may not be doing as well as you'd like it to do, while the game that you hate seems to be thriving endlessly with no end in sight. That can be kind of frustrating and honestly kind of confusing. I've got a lot that I want to talk about and go over, but of course, before we can talk about some things, we have to cover all the fundamental basics first. So let's start off by talking about Dead by Daylight's limited future. As many of you are already aware, Dead by Daylight has really cemented itself as the iconic asymmetrical horror, largely by being able to claim a lot of licensed content. But as some of you may have noticed, they are starting to run out of large, iconic figures, especially from the movie industry. Other licenses that they would like to pick up are either not available, unwilling, or the rights are scattered amongst so many rights holders that it would cost a small fortune to put a DLC together, ultimately making it not financially possible. Now, at this point, we can see that Dead by Daylight is starting to cross over more into the video game space. We've got Castlevania, for example, coming this fall, and that does sound interesting. But here's the really big problem. It seems now that they've kind of figured out the formula for the game, what works best, how to balance things. It's the game's limited framework that is really ultimately holding things back. And what I mean by that is that the selling point of Dead by Daylight is primarily the chase. And the chase revolves around an obstacle course that is basically a series of short walls and window vaults or pallets. And that's pretty much the entire game, and there's only so many ways to interact with those types of environments, since the main gameplay loop they have decided to pursue is this sort of like loop-centric buying time style gameplay balance, which, to be fair, is basically what they kind of started with and all they really had to work with given the current framework of the game. Now, I know some of you might say, well, what if they just changed the framework? That's incredibly hard to do in a post-launch game because you're essentially talking about throwing the whole game in the trash can and then rebuilding a whole brand new game and hoping everybody loves this new game just as much as they loved the old one. 9 times out of 10, though, you're going to have a large part of the community that will not like being forced into that transition. That said, I do think Dead by Daylight has a plan for that, but we'll talk more about that later. The point I'm making right now is that Dead by Daylight does have dwindling resources, not only in running out of iconic, strong IPs with large fan bases to snag, but also in how they can execute those IPs within the limited framework of the game. In my opinion, I think one of the better examples is comparing Nemesis with Xenomorph. Two characters that are very similar, and I personally would go so far as to say that Xenomorph is basically just a better version of Nemesis. And that's basically what's going to happen going forward in the future, is you're just going to see a lot of the same mechanics, recycled, reused, but improved upon, but this is going to leave older killers more and more by the wayside. I think Vecna is a really, really good example of this. They really just tried to break the mold with creativity on Vecna. You've got multiple spells, you can cycle through them on the fly. These spells do a lot of interesting things, including flipping pallets back up. But what does it really come down to? He's an M1 killer with a mobile utility spell, one spell that helps him basically defeat a pallet loop, and then a spell that he can use for tracking to help like locate or find survivors. And these sorts of things appear in a lot of their current kits. Let's go back to Xenomorph. Through the tunnels, that gives you your mobility. You can hear footsteps above ground and even see them. So then there's your tracking. And the tail, of course, gives you a way to defeat looping. And that's the formula you're pretty much going to see in every single killer going forward. It's just going to be dressed and rearranged in certain ways. Once we get to Castlevania, we're probably going to get Dracula, of course. And you're going to see Dracula will have a glide, which maybe they'll do a bat form, maybe they'll do a wolf form, hard to say. But it's going to be a mobility trait, right? He'll probably have a blood scent or a blood sense ability that he can use for tracking. And then he'll have something that he can use to help him defeat or mind game a loop. But enough about Dracula. What this basically means is that every time a new killer comes out, the novelty is going to wear off faster and faster and faster. Post-edit dusk here. So while I've been going through this video, I realized I haven't been doing a good job of explaining exactly why the novelty is wearing off or is going to wear off. And that is simply because as players start to see the same things over and over and over again, it's just going to be something they've already seen, and that's going to get boring once they get through whatever the new theme is. You know, is it a crazy guy with a ball bat this time around? Is it a vampire this time around? What is it? But the gameplay mechanics will still ultimately be the same, which means that the only tool left for developers is just power creep. So then players are going to be like, well, this is just a more powerful version of something that already exists, which power creep has its limits. So the developers are just going to be stuck making something strong for like the first month and then nerfing it back down to the same level as everything else. And again, this is a formula that just gets old. In fact, I've already heard some people complaining about this very thing. Anyway, back to the rest of the video. And that kind of brings us to perks, which many of you have probably already noticed that perks are already falling into the same sort of, as new perks come out, they're just kind of better versions of previous perks, right? And they have tried to put nice little individual twists and stuff on those perks, but ultimately it comes down to the same problem. There's only so many game elements to interact with or boost, and there are a lot of perks, right? So eventually they're just going to kind of have to recycle ideas, but give them some window dressing to create like a fun theme or thematic, or maybe tweak one because it's a good candidate for a potential fix with a problem in the game, all that stuff. So the next question is, why not make Dead by Daylight 2 with a broader framework and more mechanics? Unfortunately, there really can never be a Dead by Daylight 2. And that is because the tools that helped make Dead by Daylight so successful, which is fear of missing out mechanics and sunk cost fallacy, work against Dead by Daylight when it comes time to try and migrate their player base to a new game. So their only real option is to try and reinvent and reiterate the current game that they have, to literally try and rebuild it with the new framework, and to look at other successful or partially successful ASIMs for inspiration, and to look at reoccurring suggestions from their community where they can see that there is a lot of popularity maybe behind certain ideas. And that brings us to the 2v8 game mode. Now, before they did their live stream where they revealed some of the mechanics, I very early on predicted that they would do away with some of the standardized hooked mechanics because hooks are not a great mechanic. And I predicted that they would use Pyramid Head's style of just stab the survivor and teleport them to a random hook. That is such a good mechanic and such a better way to handle things. And sure enough, the 2v8 game mode is going to use that mechanic for all killers. Now, why did I predict they were going to go that way? That is because we've seen people lament the loss of the game Friday the 13th, and people talk about the fun that they've had, as well as other games and some of the hype you see in TCM and Killer Clowns. Like, a lot of players have flocked to these games and have enjoyed them. Home Sweet Home, and there have been tons and tons and tons of ASIMs out there. Soul Snake, there was Individuals Down, there was that, there was the name of it, was like Haunted Something, there was a giant baby in it, there's Soul Dossier, there was Gold Express, there was the one that kind of started out as a single battle royale before it devolved into it, that's a list, I go on. But the point is that a lot of the more successful ones out of there have the theme of there being a lot more chaos, a lot more running around, mobility, engagement, all the things that Dead by Daylight is missing. So I knew that this is stuff that the Dead by Daylight developers have looked at and noticed because they have a history at looking at other successful ASIMs and trying to adapt ideas from them. VHS, for example, helped Dead by Daylight redo how their blood web mastery system works. They borrowed theirs. They took inspiration from last year's Strangler, and that led to the Death Slinger. So on and so forth, etc., etc. A lot of these other games also have classes and roles, and they already revealed that there will be classes and roles in the 2v8 game mode. I'll be honest, that did surprise me because that is such a major shift. But I do have a pretty bold prediction for how they're going to change generators, because I promise those will not stay the same, because generators are not a good mechanic either. They're pretty boring. So what's my prediction on how they're going to change generators? Well, there has been a very, very popular reoccurring request that has been happening since like the second year of Dead by Daylight, and that is to make generators repair very quickly, but requires survivors to go find parts to bring back to the generator so that they're moving around the map and doing things, which is a lot like what happens in like Friday the 13th and all these other games, right? Those games have you bring parts back and then just do a short mini game to repair a car. Or if you're talking about last year, repair something so that you can open a gate, whatever, so on and so forth, right? Post-edit Dusk here again. I went off on a little bit too much of a side tangent. I couldn't really fix it with editing, so I'm just going to finish the video here, post-edit style. Yeah. So anyway, let me talk about why I think they're going to do these generator parts. Not only because it was such a highly requested feature, but because when they were teasing the 2v8 game mode, they also mentioned that perks are going to get replaced with classes. And they said, oh, some people are going to like looping, some people are going to like repairing stuff. And so basically, I think what we're going to see from what the developers said is we're going to see like an engineer, runners, stealthers. In other words, people to go get parts, people to distract the killers, and then people to install the parts. Now, everybody will probably be able to do any and all of that stuff, just in case you get 8 loopers in the same game. They have to still be able to, go get the parts and fix the generators, but they won't be as good at those things, right? So it'll take them longer to do that, but they'll be really good at running the killers, right? So yeah, that's why I think, one of the reasons why I think generators are going to change a little bit, because that would better support these classes, right? But that also shows something else, which highlights everything else that I've talked about, in that there won't be perks. One of the limiting factors is the fact that they've been using sunk cost fallacy and FOMO to kind of entrench their player base. But then that acts as a giant wall to keep out new players, right? Well, they'll have to pivot. And I think the developers know that they need to pivot away from that, so that they can get the next generation of players, coming into their game to really like create a long-term plan, another 8 years, so to speak. So yeah, they're getting rid of part of the grind wall, the perks, which honestly is probably a pretty smart idea at this point. They have enough in the way of like new killers, and there's a ton of content. I don't think they need the giant grind wall. They could add like light progression, maybe where you have to level up your class, but that would be a lot easier for a new player to get into. So there's sort of limited progression, and then rely on renewable systems like the 1 month ranked season that doesn't have any sunk fallacy cost associated with it at all. Just every month you pop in, you do the ladder, you get your rewards, you're good to go, right? And that's way more new player friendly. So that's probably what we're going to see, because that makes the most sense from a business standpoint. And with all the breadcrumbs and things that they've left us in the teasers, that makes all the other stuff kind of make sense. Everything comes together pretty well when you look at it like that. And of course, if they're going to all this trouble, that also guarantees there is no Dead by Daylight 2 being worked on. The 2v8 game mode is basically Dead by Daylight 2. But I have one more extremely bold prediction. I predict that the player base is going to love the 2v8 game mode. I think everything I've seen is good, right? Now, they did say that they were going to put it up only for a little bit, take it down, work on it, and then put it back up. And they were going to keep working on it till they got it right. Well, I predict, and this is my big prediction, that the player base is going to go ravenous for it. And when it's gone, they're going to be really, really, really like chomping at the bit to bring it back. So I think the second time they bring it back, it'll be there to stay. They'll just work on it while it's live. And I think eventually down the road, the 1v4 game mode gets phased out. I think it becomes a dead game mode. So that's my big prediction. Now, how long does that take to happen? That's probably going to be a pretty slow process, but I do think that that's the future of Dead by Daylight. And when Dead by Daylight eventually dies, it is because they are able to come up with another game that is a worthy successor, and they've just basically like ran out of places to take Dead by Daylight's current like kits and the structure and all that stuff. And at that point, they may just let the 2v8 game mode, ride off into the sunset, maintain that niche player base and all that. So with that said, I think we'll wrap things up here. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.